Our home was buzzing with the kind of energy that only a well-planned party could bring. The sound of clinking glasses, laughter, and the soft hum of background music created an atmosphere that felt warm and celebratory. From the outside, everything seemed perfect, and I was determined to keep it that way. Sophia had spent weeks preparing for this event. She loved hosting. It gave her a chance to show off her impeccable taste and knack for creating a beautiful setting. Tonight was no different. The dining table was adorned with delicate floral arrangements and sparkling silverware, the kind that only came out for special occasions. The food, carefully catered, looked more like art than dinner, and even the lighting had been meticulously adjusted to cast the room in a soft, flattering glow. As I stood in the corner, a drink in hand, I couldn't help but admire her. Sophia was stunning, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her curves and caught the attention of every person in the room. Her dark hair was pulled into an elegant updo, and a pair of diamond earrings sparkled as she moved. She always had a way of making everything look effortless. Tonight, she looked like a vision, the kind of woman people couldn't help but notice. But even as I watched her glide through the crowd, something gnawed at me. It was subtle at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind, but it was persistent. Sophia was smiling, laughing, and playing the perfect hostess, yet there was something off about her. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Her laugh felt a touch too loud, almost forced, and her eyes, they darted around the room like she was looking for someone, or perhaps avoiding someone. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was overthinking things. This was a big night for her. She always stressed about these events going smoothly. Maybe she was just tired. After all, we'd both been running ourselves ragged preparing for this. Still, little moments throughout the evening made me pause. There was the way she avoided standing too close to me, as if the casual intimacy of a hand on her back or a kiss on her cheek might crack the facade she was working so hard to maintain. And then there were the fleeting moments when her mask slipped, when she thought no one was watching. Her face would go blank, her shoulders tense. At one point, I tried to ground her, to remind her that we were a team. I reached for her hand as she passed by, hoping to share a small, reassuring moment amidst the chaos. But she barely acknowledged me, murmuring something about needing to check on the caterers before slipping away. I stood there, hands still outstretched, feeling a pang of rejection I couldn't quite explain. I tried to brush it off, to refocus on the guests and enjoy the party. But as the evening wore on, I became more and more aware of how disconnected Sophia seemed. She was physically present but emotionally distant, like she was playing a role in a play she no longer cared about. I noticed her checking her phone more than once, always quick to put it away when someone came near. Normally I wouldn't think twice about it. Sophia was a social butterfly, constantly coordinating with friends and managing our schedules. But tonight it felt different. She wasn't texting friends about the party or scrolling through social media. It was something else, something she didn't want me to see. Despite my growing unease, I kept up appearances. I laughed at jokes, refilled drinks, and engaged in small talk. I wanted to believe that whatever was bothering Sophia was just stress or exhaustion, nothing more. But deep down, a part of me knew better. There was a moment that stood out, a moment I couldn't shake. Sophia was standing near the bar, talking to one of our friends. I watched her from across the room, trying to figure out what was bothering me so much. And then I saw it. For just a second, her eyes flickered toward the door, a flash of something unspoken crossing her face. It was so brief I almost missed it, but it was there: anxiety, anticipation, maybe even fear. I wanted to go to her, to ask if she was okay, but I hesitated. Something in me told me not to push, not yet. Instead, I stayed where I was, watching her closely, hoping for some kind of explanation to present itself. The party carried on, and Sophia continued to play the role of the perfect hostess. She smiled, laughed, and charmed everyone around her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a performance. And as much as I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, the nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let me. I didn't know it then, but that feeling, the subtle, creeping suspicion, was my body warning me. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet moment before everything came crashing down. The party was in full swing, the kind of gathering where conversations flowed as freely as the wine. I was mid-conversation with a couple of friends, trying my best to enjoy the evening despite the unease that had settled in my chest. Then, I saw him. At first, he didn't seem out of place. He was well-dressed, like most of the guests, wearing a tailored suit and an easy, confident smile. He had that aura of someone who belonged everywhere, calm, composed, and entirely at ease. But there was something about him that felt off. I didn't recognize him, and yet it felt like I should. He didn't hover near the edges of the crowd like most new faces would. He didn't introduce himself to anyone as if trying to make connections. Instead, he moved with purpose, weaving through the room like a predator tracking his prey. I couldn't help but notice the way heads turned as he passed. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew people's attention, but not in the way you'd admire a guest who brought energy to the room. This felt different, sharper. I watched as he made his way across the room. He wasn't mingling, wasn't making polite small talk. His focus was singular. He was heading straight for Sophia. She didn't see him at first, her back turned as she adjusted a floral arrangement on the bar. But when she did, it was as if the air had been knocked out of her. She froze, her body stiffening in a way that was almost imperceptible. But I noticed. I knew her too well not to notice. She turned slowly, and for a moment it felt like the world stopped. Their eyes met, and in that instant her expression betrayed her. It was only for a split second, but it was enough. Her usual composure faltered, replaced by a mix of shock, fear, and something else, something I couldn't quite name. He smiled at her, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't warm or friendly, it was the kind of smile that carried weight, meaning. Sophia didn't return it. In fact, she looked away, quickly reaching for her wine glass, her hand trembling slightly. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this man? And why did his presence rattle her so much? I wanted to go over, to insert myself into whatever silent exchange was happening between them, but I hesitated. Something in me told me to wait, to watch. He didn't approach her right away. Instead, he lingered near the bar, striking up a conversation with someone nearby, but his eyes kept drifting back to Sophia, as if he was waiting for the right moment. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed desperate to avoid him. She busied herself with trivial tasks, straightening napkins, adjusting place settings, anything to keep her hands occupied. It wasn't long before he made his move. He walked over to our table, his strides confident and unhurried. I felt my stomach tighten as he approached. There was no reason for me to feel this way, I didn't even know him. But there was something about the way he carried himself, the way he looked at Sophia, that set me on edge. He extended his hand, introducing himself with a name I barely registered. His voice was smooth, too smooth, like someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. I shook his hand, forcing a polite smile, but my instincts screamed at me to be cautious. Sophia didn't say a word. She sat there, her wine glass clutched tightly in her hand, her knuckles white. She wouldn't meet my eyes, nor his. Her silence was deafening, and it only added to the growing tension. I tried to make small talk, to ease the awkwardness, but he wasn't interested in me. His focus was entirely on Sophia. He asked her questions she barely answered, made comments she barely acknowledged. It was as if the two of them were engaged in some silent battle, one I couldn't understand but could feel all the same. The more I watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't a random encounter. This man knew her in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. And Sophia's reaction only confirmed it. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was terrified. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the image of them together, the way his eyes lingered on her, the way her body seemed to shrink under his gaze. The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Who was he? What was he doing here? And why did it feel like he held some kind of power over her? By the time he walked away, I felt like a stranger in my own home, a guest at a party I was supposed to be hosting. Sophia's betrayal hadn't yet been spoken, but in my gut, I already knew the truth. The whispers started subtly, almost as if the universe was trying to soften the blow before delivering the full impact. A friend pulled me aside, their expression uneasy, as though they were debating whether to speak up. They hesitated, their eyes darting toward Sophia and the man who had so boldly inserted himself into our lives. "I think you should know," they began, their voice low. "That guy isn't just some random guest." I stared at them, confusion and dread swirling inside me. The way they avoided meeting my eyes told me whatever they were about to say wasn't good. "He's been close to Sophia," they continued, their words carefully chosen. "Too close." It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, a mistake. Sophia wasn't perfect, but she was mine. She wouldn't do this. She couldn't. I asked for details, my voice shaky but firm. The answers came hesitantly, reluctantly, as though my friend was afraid of the consequences of speaking the truth. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the stolen glances that others had noticed but I ignored, all of it painted a picture I didn't want to see. I felt sick, my stomach churning with a mix of anger and betrayal. The man who had casually walked into my home, shaken my hand, and sat at my table wasn't a stranger. He was Sophia's lover. The weight of the revelation hit me like a freight train. Memories flooded my mind, moments that had once seemed ordinary now tinged with suspicion. Her distant behavior, the way she'd been guarding her phone lately, the hollow excuses for why she was late or preoccupied, all of it made sense now. I returned to the party, my head spinning. I didn't know what to do, how to act. My body moved on autopilot, navigating the crowd, nodding at guests, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. I needed to see her, to confront her, to make sense of what I had just learned. When I found her, she was sitting at our table, the man beside her. He was leaning back casually, his arm draped across the back of her chair as though he belonged there. She wasn't looking at him, though. Her eyes were fixed on her glass, her fingers tracing the rim nervously. I stood there for a moment, watching them. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. My wife, the woman I had built my life with, the woman I trusted with everything, was sitting inches away from the man who had come between us. Sophia looked up and saw me then. Her face went pale, her eyes widening in what could only be described as panic. She knew. She knew the facade was crumbling, that the truth was no longer something she could hide. I sat down across from them, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't trust myself to speak, didn't know what would come out if I opened my mouth. Instead, I just stared at her, willing her to explain, to deny, to do anything that would make this all go away. But she didn't, she couldn't. The guilt in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. The man, on the other hand, seemed entirely unfazed. He greeted me with a smug smile, as if he was enjoying the spectacle. His confidence was infuriating, his presence a reminder of how powerless I felt in that moment. The rest of the evening was a blur. I stayed at the table, my mind racing with questions I couldn't yet bring myself to ask. Sophia avoided looking at me, her shoulders hunched as though she was trying to make herself invisible. The man eventually left, offering me a firm handshake and a polite nod, as if this were nothing more than a business transaction. When he was gone, the room felt both too quiet and unbearably loud. I could hear the distant chatter of guests, the clinking of glasses, but it all seemed muted, irrelevant. All I could think about was her, the lies, and the betrayal that now sat between us like a gaping wound. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't trust myself to. Instead, I sat there in silence, staring at the woman I thought I knew, and felt the sharp edges of my world begin to crumble. The life I had built, the love I thought was unshakable, was gone, and all that remained was the hollow ache of betrayal. I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. It was a relief in a way, cutting through the suffocating haze of the party and the chaos swirling in my mind. My hands were trembling, and my chest felt tight, as though my body was struggling to process the storm of emotions that had erupted inside me. Betrayal, anger, confusion. The night sky stretched above me, vast and indifferent, as if mocking the petty dramas of human lives. I stood on the porch, gripping the railing, trying to steady myself. Inside, the laughter and music continued, oblivious to the disaster unfolding in my heart. I couldn't stop thinking about Sophia. The woman I had loved so deeply, so completely, had been living a double life. It was like a cruel joke. I replayed the moments we'd shared, the nights we'd spent wrapped in each other's arms, the promises we'd made. They all felt tainted now, rewritten by the knowledge of her betrayal. I thought of the intimacy we once had, the way she used to look at me like I was her whole world. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the trust, the vulnerability, the sense of being completely known and accepted. That was what hurt the most. She had given that part of herself to someone else, and it felt like she'd stolen it from me too. The man, her lover, haunted my thoughts. The way he had walked into my home, sat at my table, and acted as though he belonged there. It was sickening. His smug confidence, the way he seemed to revel in the tension, made my blood boil. But even worse was the way Sophia had reacted to him. She hadn't stood up to him, hadn't told him to leave. She had let him be there, in our space, as though his presence was something she had grown used to. I clenched the railing tighter, my knuckles white. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask but couldn't silence. How long had this been going on? What did he have that I didn't? Was I not enough for her? These thoughts burrowed into my brain like thorns, each one more painful than the last. I tried to rationalize it, to make sense of the senseless. Maybe she'd been unhappy, I thought. Maybe I'd missed the signs, been too caught up in my own life to notice hers unraveling. But no matter how I turned it over in my mind, it didn't excuse what she'd done. There were ways to fix problems in a marriage, honest conversations, therapy, anything, but she hadn't chosen any of those. She'd chosen betrayal. The sound of the door opening behind me pulled me out of my thoughts. I didn't turn around, didn't want to face whoever had followed me outside. But the soft click of heels told me it was her. Sophia. She didn't say anything at first, and neither did I. We stood there in silence, the tension between us palpable. I could feel her presence, could hear the faint hitch in her breathing, as though she was trying to find the right words. But what could she possibly say? Sorry. It felt hollow, meaningless. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. Are you okay? It was such a simple question, yet it infuriated me. How could I possibly be okay? My world had just been turned upside down. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, and my words were trapped beneath the weight of everything I was feeling. She stood there for a while longer, as though waiting for me to say something, to give her an opening. But I didn't. I couldn't even look at her. Eventually she turned and went back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The intimacy we had once shared now felt like a distant memory, a beautiful illusion that had been shattered. I couldn't stop thinking about the moments we'd spent together, the nights we'd stayed up talking, the times she'd held my hand when I was at my lowest, the promises we'd whispered in the dark. They all felt like lies now, or at least like they belonged to someone else. I stayed outside for a long time, long enough for the cold to seep into my bones. I wasn't sure what to do, what to say, or how to move forward. All I knew was that something fundamental had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. Eventually I went back inside. The party was winding down, guests saying their goodbyes and gathering their coats. Sophia was nowhere to be seen. I avoided the small talk, the polite thank yous, the forced smiles. I just wanted everyone to leave so I could be alone, truly alone, to figure out what came next. As the last guest walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of relief. The house was quiet now, the way it had been before everything fell apart. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy, oppressive, filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. And in that silence, I realized the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning after the party was eerily quiet. The house, once filled with laughter and music, now seemed like a shell of itself, haunted by the memories of the night before. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, but the warmth it brought felt false. There was no warmth here, not anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I hadn't slept, too consumed by the chaos in my mind to even close my eyes. The questions that had kept me awake all night returned with the morning light, sharper and more relentless. Sophia's betrayal wasn't just a crack in our marriage, it was a wrecking ball that had reduced it to rubble. I replayed everything over and over again, searching for answers I wasn't sure I wanted. How had I missed the signs? Was I that blind, that naive? Or had I chosen to ignore them, clinging to the belief that the life we'd built together was unshakable? Sophia eventually emerged from the bedroom, her footsteps hesitant as she made her way toward me. She looked as if she hadn't slept either. Her makeup from the night before was smudged, her hair disheveled, and there was a heaviness in her eyes that mirrored my own. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as though unsure if she was welcome in the same space as me. I didn't acknowledge her at first, keeping my gaze fixed on the coffee cup in front of me. The silence between us was deafening, every second stretching into an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." I nodded slowly, but my throat felt too tight to respond. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what she had to say, wasn't sure I could handle the truth, but at the same time I knew I couldn't move forward without it. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly together as though she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. "I never meant for you to find out this way," she began, her voice trembling. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and I saw the cracks in her facade. She wasn't the composed, confident woman who had hosted the party the night before. She was broken, just like me. But instead of feeling pity, I felt anger. She had done this to us, to me. Her words came slowly, each one feeling like a knife to the heart. She told me about the affair, about how it had started during a rough patch in our marriage, about how she had felt neglected, unseen. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling like she was fading into the background of my life. But as she talked, all I could think about was the choices she had made. She hadn't come to me, hadn't told me how she felt. She had turned to someone else, someone who had no right to be a part of our lives. And now she was sitting here, asking for forgiveness when she hadn't even given me the chance to fight for us. I let her speak, let her pour out her guilt and her excuses. And when she was done, I finally found my voice. It was steady, colder than I expected. "You didn't just betray me," I said. "You destroyed the foundation of everything we built together. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" She didn't have an answer, and I didn't expect one. There was nothing she could say to undo what had been done. The trust between us was gone, shattered beyond repair. As we sat there in silence, I realized I had a choice to make. I could let this betrayal consume me, let it define the rest of my life. Or I could walk away, rebuild my life without the weight of her actions dragging me down. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. Sophia looked up at me, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't meet her gaze. "I need time," I said, "and I need space." Without another word, I left the room, grabbing my keys and walking out the door. The crisp morning air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I could ever forgive her or if I even wanted to. But as I got into the car and started the engine, I knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would have to find myself again, piece by piece. And for now, that was enough.